Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I'll be providing my book review of the book The Two-Faced Queen by NIck Martell, the second book in the saga of the Legacy of the Mercenary King. I read the first book right before I started my channel, and so I didn't have the opportunity to review it for the channel, but I read the first book and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I picked up the first book, The Kingdom of Liars, after watching NIck Martell's interview with Brandon Sanderson on his channel, where Brandon brought Nick in because Brandon wanted to talk about the publishing industry and how to break in, and Brandon, hasn't broken in for 20 years now, and so he was looking for someone with a newer perspective. And Nick Martell not only is a recent break into the industry, but he sold the first book when he was only 23 years old. And I thought that was very fascinating that he could sell that young. And so I wanted to read the book and see what it was about. And also Brandon Sanderson blurbed the book and really enjoyed it. So that gave me also hope. And when I read the book, I thought it was also very, very entertaining. I had a few problems with it, particularly with the main character, and also with some of the language used, and also a little bit of the world building. But as a whole, I thought it was a very, very solid book, like a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, like very solid. So I was interested in picking up the sequel, didn't really, and ironically, the day that I picked up the sequel, The Two-Faced Queen, I got a notification that it had been exactly 1 year since I had finished The Kingdom of Liars. It's funny that I read them exactly a year apart. And so I finally got The Two-Faced Queen recently, and I read it, and I have very mixed thoughts about it. I sometimes am interested in looking at people who have similar feelings towards these books, and ironically, I very much line up with the book reviewer Patrick Leo, who I follow on YouTube and Goodreads, who I think is an excellent book reviewer, possibly one of the best book reviewers in the business. And he has very similar thoughts to me, where the first half of this book was incredibly boring, slow, non-engaging. The second half of the book is incredibly well written and engaging and interesting, and it makes up for it, kind of, but not enough. The problem that this book has is that a lot of the setup for the general plot of the series was already done in the first book. And so this book doesn't have too much setup to do for the overall plot, and so the first half of the book kind of meanders. Secondly, this book has kind of like a standalone plot within it, a smaller individual plot. And that plot line isn't introduced until almost halfway through the book. And not halfway, about a third of the way through. It takes a while for it to be introduced. And so as a result, the first third of the book, almost the first half of the book, kind of meanders. It doesn't have a huge purpose. You don't have a singular goal that our characters are going towards. Michael is trying to prove his innocence in this book, but he's not taking actions in this book that are directing him towards that goal. Like, you don't see him go do something and you think, that's a smart way to try to do this. It just seems like, well, okay, I guess we're following this mercenary, I guess we're going to this party, I guess we're, like, there was no rhyme or reason, it felt like, to a lot of the scenes in the beginning. Now, there's a villain introduced, the Heartbreaker serial killer, who is very mysterious, and that's the central plot of trying to find this serial killer in the book. And I thought that as soon as that was introduced, the book picked up significantly. It becomes a mix between a monster hunter type book and also a mystery action thriller book. And once that happens, the pace picks up significantly. And I really thought that the second half of the book was so well paced and so action packed. But because the first half was so weak, I think it's going to turn off a lot of readers, and I think a lot of people won't be willing to read the book series because they'll feel like it's too hard to get into and not much of a payoff at the end. There is quite a good payoff, I think. And Martell sets himself up for the third book, which I don't know if it's going to be the final book, but he sets himself up for the third book really well. But the process of getting there isn't always the best. Some of the standout characters in this one, I thought Serena, the queen, or queen in waiting, I should say, I thought she was very interesting. I thought she was really well handled. I also thought that Michael Kingman's mother, who shows up here, I thought she was handled well, as was the new character Oliver. I thought he was really well written. And I also thought that his companion throughout the book, Naomi, was also very interesting. But another problem this book has is a lot of the characters from the first book were not memorable. The main cast, the central cast of like 5 or 6 characters were memorable, and I remembered them going into this book. But everyone else, all the little side characters, just were not memorable. And so Nick Martell does not take the time to explain why these characters are important. He kind of assumes you already remember. And as a result, I felt like I was playing catch-up the whole time, and it wasn't until the end that I truly got to understand why these characters were important again. And that kind of stems from an issue that I think Nick Martell was really hesitant to do the heavy exposition dumps in this book. He was hesitant to just re-explain everything from the first book. I think that is because the fantasy community has, or at least a section of the fantasy community, has really knocked on this, particularly like the Wheel of Time fandom really complained about that when Robert Jordan did it in every book, and it never really bothered me. I just kept reading, and I read those books fairly quickly together, not like all in a row, but I read them like a month or 2 apart each. And so as a result, I generally remembered a lot of the details, but I also forgot a lot, so I was okay with the exposition dumps. I feel like this book, if he had those exposition dumps, they would have helped him out a lot more. I think that's one of the reasons why I also like Shannara so much, because it also has those exposition dumps. But he was so hesitant here, and I think that's because he's trying to follow the newer style of fantasy. He's trying to represent the newer version of fantasy, which is a much more traditional style story with some fantastical elements and world building and magic systems. So there were those problems, and again, one of my issues from this book that is also present in the first book is that there's a lot of language. It's not the most heavy amount I've ever read in a book, but there's some significant language, and it just doesn't fit because there's only really one character who's swearing throughout the book, and it's Michael Kingman, the main character, the point of view character. Just about everyone else is pretty much clean for the most part in their language, and so it feels out of place, and also it's just not an engaging characteristic. It's not something that's endearing or makes me want to keep reading. And I think that he limits his audience, that a lot of people will turn off the book because he has this kind of language. Whereas I'll make the same comparison I made earlier to Robert Jordan. He just made up his own swear words so that the audience doesn't necessarily feel uncomfortable reading them. Or someone like Brandon Sanderson, who for the most part just doesn't have swear words. Occasionally, like a swear word will fit in, but it's not present in Brandon's writing. Whereas here, it's very present, and it's just with one character, and it's the main character, and it's just not pleasant to read. And so it wasn't an enjoyable experience in that sense. So as you can tell, I have very mixed thoughts on this book. I think that the ending is really good, but I think the beginning is really poor, and so as a result, it kind of meanders in the middle grade for me. Not middle grade like young adults, like middle, like it doesn't get a high mark, but it also doesn't get a low mark. I would give this book a 6.5 out of 10. It's fine. I think it's a positive experience overall, but I think that Nick Martell has a lot to improve with his writing style. I don't know whether this can be fixed in book 3 or if he needs to start a brand new series to try to test out a better writing style. But there are elements I loved in this book, so I think that I can still kind of recommend it. But be careful, the first half of this book and the first half of the first book are kind of boring. So overall, that's my review of The Two-Faced Queen. If you've read this book, let me know your thoughts down below. If you read the first book and are interested in reading this book, let me know your thoughts as well. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.